Detroit Become Human, Quantic Dream has arguably achieved what it's been trying to do ever since its very first game nearly 20 years ago. Detroit Become Human presents players with a story that's often capable of evoking genuine and heartfelt emotions from them, without resorting to the weird or bizarre plot devices and cheap tricks the studio has used in the past. As a result, Detroit has some really great moments, and some not so great ones. Here are 5 things we loved about the game, and 2 things we didn't. A story like Detroit, that hinges on the interconnecting tales of 3 central playable characters, would be nothing if players didn't actually care for those characters. Throughout the game's 10 or so hour runtime, we jump between the fates of 3 androids. There's maternal domestic servant Kara, who's made to wait on an abusive father and young charge Alice. There's the relatively well-off Marcus, who forms a bond with a kind elderly human and yet yearns to find his own place in the world. And then there's state-of-the-art prototype Connor, whose primary function is to hunt down other androids who have gone deviant. That is to say, broken their programming and developed thoughts and feelings of their own. Thankfully for Detroit, and despite some awkward scripting, all 3 characters are intriguing from the get-go, though personally I found Connor to be by far the best of the bunch. Not only were his gameplay sections the most engrossing, and the most traditionally gamey, but the ambiguity of his motivations made him a fascinating unknown quantity for the majority of the game, and by extension it felt like he gave players the most creative freedom to make more difficult or controversial choices. It's all a bit melodramatic, of course, with the androids being made to choose whether to bend to a life of inferiority or rise up against their oppressors, but it does feel like for the most part your choices have meaningful results. And it's probably a good sign and a credit to the writing when you go back to the story and find it so hard to make decisions that conflict with your original choices, just to see what would have happened.
Lieutenant Anderson, my name is Connor. I'm the android sent by CyberLife. I looked for you at the station, but nobody knew where you were.
A lot of the power of these characters, of course, comes from the performances, and all 3 actors do a fantastic job. It's almost a shame the script forces them to overdo things at times. The subtlety and nuance that the actors are able to convey with just an expression, due to Quantic's advanced tech, means that it's often jarring when a character has to explicitly state how they're feeling when you can see it quite clearly from their performance. There's a brilliant, cold and calculated menace that emanates from Connor at times, and yet then at others, you see his inner conflict as direct orders clash with brand new emotions. And it's all without actor Brian Deckhart saying a word. Marcus and Kara are not as nuanced, but that's really to do with their motivations being more one note. Kara in protecting a child at all costs, and Marcus in leading a revolution asking for equal rights for androids. It's also because Connor has another great character to bounce off of in Hank, his human, android-hating cop partner, whose actor Clancy Brown brings enough self-awareness to the role that he doesn't just become one big walking cliché. Instead, their relationship is one of the most intriguing and moving parts in the game. And that's down to Quantic's performance capture technology, which was 4 years in the making, and really does feel like a landmark achievement for games.
Bartender? The same again, please.
See that, Jim wonders at technology. Make it a double.
The flowchart is a bit of a divisive feature in Detroit. Some argue that it takes all the mystery out of how the game actually works, but I like the way it involves and illuminates players on the usually vague your choices matter narrative gameplay. You can see which decisions carry weight and how much or how little you might have missed during one particular scenario. And any one of your main 3 characters can die at multiple points throughout the story, in some cases cutting off their arc completely. It feels like there's a lot at stake when you know hours of play can be missed out on or gained because of one seemingly insignificant choice. And the flowchart serves to act as a rough guide for players determined to see all possible outcomes, pointing them towards which actions caused them to originally spin off in a different direction. That's a big time saver in a game like this, and it shows the developer to be respectful of its players in that it doesn't try to fool them into thinking literally every playthrough is unique, as was the case with so many of these types of games in the past, previous Quantic Dream games included. And one playthrough really isn't enough to see everything the game has to offer by a long shot. You might think you more or less got the full measure of a scene or a scenario, but going back and tackling it from a different angle yields surprisingly varied results. The story can be impressively complex in some ways, and disappointingly restrictive in others. People tend to either love or hate linear interactive stories like this one, where walking, making choices, playing out a cutscene with the odd button prompt or QuickTime sequence, and solving simple puzzles is the full extent that you're actually involved with the action. However, Detroit always finds ways to keep you focused, and doesn't expect you to be content with just watching cutscenes or walking from one objective to the next. It tones down the button-bashy QTEs of former Quantic games, and yet manages to retain a real sense of pace and urgency. There is, of course, the usual and often cringeworthy press X to sadness, in place of the now iconic press X to Jason, but Detroit is at least smart enough to keep gameplay varied and constantly in motion, even at times where you'd think it was safe enough to put the controller down. And obviously, as far as looks go, Detroit is top of the class. Quantic Dream's visual flair and eye for cinematography is very much present in every frame of Detroit. It's just a shame that this makes it all the more jarring that the writing isn't quite as on form. Everything is beautiful and interesting to look at, and this is all complemented by beautiful, if sometimes emotionally overbearing, sound design. The star of the show, though, as we've mentioned, is Quantic Dream's motion capture system, which is advanced enough to capture little twitches and blinks and subtle performances that take video game acting to the next level. Lighting also deserves a mention, as it sets the tone and atmosphere of this near-future noir world just as confidently as the musical score does. But not everything works as well as you'd hope it to. For as many choices and different paths Detroit offers, it still restricts players in ways you wish it didn't. Invisible walls abound, cutting you off to that free will that the game constantly harps on about. And the choices the game does allow you to make are all too often disappointingly binary. Dialogue options are usually limited to 4 words loosely describing the potential response, and these don't always convey full intent, which is frustrating when these responses are key to crafting your character. Additionally, Detroit isn't free of classic David Cage-isms, such as magical if illogical plot devices like Marcus possessing superpowers whenever it suits the story, and a couple of plot twists that actually make very little sense the moment you think about them in depth. Also, show, don't tell just isn't in Quantic Dream's vocabulary. Every interesting idea that the game presents needs to be underlined about 20 times before it can be sure you've gotten it. And a few years ago, that would be understandable, given that the technology would not have been able to convey all of the nuances of non-verbal expression. But times have changed, and Quantic needs to trust in its players and its own technology more. Detroit just isn't as subtle or as clever as it thinks it is, and some of the references to current world problems or historical social events are amazingly ham-fisted. Some side characters are drawn in incredibly broad strokes to allow for how little time we spend with them, but under the direction of a better writer, they could have been more well-rounded. Also, the very premise of humans versus the artificial intelligence they created is overdone at this point anyway, if we're honest, but that's fine. The real draw and uniqueness of a Quantic Dream game is how they can tell that story in partnership with individual players, which for the most part, Detroit does well.
That's the only way.
What do you want to do?
The problem is, Detroit takes itself so damn seriously. Certain sections of the game, like a heist that the player carries out while the characters narrate during the planning stage, are really fun because they aren't barreling through real issues like slavery, oppression, and domestic abuse without actually saying anything about any of them. These sequences are just fun because they're fun. Detroit is determined to wallow in melodrama, however, but it simply depicts terrible, serious things and then moves on, as if it's checking off a list of themes games should tackle, despite not really knowing why it should tackle them. We would all be better off if the game contented itself with just being dumb fun, letting loose and allowing everyone to kick back and enjoy some cool, beautiful, silly sci-fi. And one thing Quantic doesn't seem to address is that narrative games aren't the unique oddity that they were when the studio first started experimenting with the genre in the 90s. Since then, and in just the last year or so, we've had brilliant games like Life is Strange, What Remains of Edith Finch, A Way Out, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, Until Dawn, exploring the medium and exploring difficult topics with much more intelligence and far fewer resources. Detroit, by comparison, can fall into the trap of being too black and white and binary to be interesting. Press X to fight oppression is not the difficult dilemma it's presented as, and actually, a lot of Quantic's presentation and execution, when compared to a lot more recent narrative games, can feel a little dated. Overall, though, this is Quantic's most accomplished game to date, though it does feel like there's some wasted potential there that could have led to something truly great. That said, we still feel like our playthrough was a fun time well spent. But what do you think? Have you picked it up? Will you? Let us know, or check out one of our other Detroit Become Human videos, or watch me try to get the rest of the team to play another Quantic Dream game in late to the party. Do like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe for more from Eurogamer. Thanks for watching. Bye!